The leather binding felt cool against my trembling fingers. I shouldn't have been there in that forgotten attic corner, where dust motes danced through broken moonlight like tiny ghosts. But desperation has a way of making you reckless, doesn't it? Of making you speak truths you've kept buried for so long that they've started poisoning you from the inside out. My voice barely registered above a whisper at first. Just me and my diary, or so I believed. I cannot marry Lord Ashton, I read aloud. The words I'd written that very afternoon, now hanging in the stale air. I would rather die than become his possession. Another pretty ornament in his collection of conquests. The admission felt dangerous even here, alone in the shadows, or what I thought was alone. Because then, God help me, then I heard it, a shift in the darkness, the whisper of expensive fabric against wood, and a voice, deep as midnight and twice as unsettling. That is quite the declaration, Miss Carwell. My heart stopped, actually stopped, because I knew that voice. Every woman in London knew that voice, the Duke of Ravensworth, and he was standing somewhere in this attic, hidden in shadows I'd thought were empty, having heard every damning word I'd just spoken aloud. Let me tell you how I ended up in that attic, confessing my darkest secrets to what I believed was empty air. It wasn't madness, though perhaps it was close enough. The evening had started like any other suffocating affair at Ravensworth Manor. My mother had insisted I wear the emerald silk. It brings out your eyes, Alina dear, which really meant it was expensive enough to catch the attention of potential husbands. Specifically, Lord Ashton, who'd been circling me like a well-dressed predator for the past 3 months. He'd cornered me near the conservatory, brandy breath hot against my ear, describing in excruciating detail the arrangements he'd make once I was his wife. The way he'd said arrangements made my skin crawl. I'd smiled, nodded, played the demure young lady my mother had trained me to be. And when he'd finally released me to refill his glass, I'd run. Not walked, run. Through corridors I barely knew, up servants' stairs I had no business climbing, until I found myself in that attic, the only place in the entire manor where the suffocating weight of expectations couldn't quite reach me. I'd brought my diary, tucked against my stays like a secret weapon. I'd been writing in it since I was 15, 7 years of hopes, fears, and truths I could never speak aloud. But that night, something broke inside me. Some final thread of composure snapped clean through. So I read aloud. Started with today's entry about Lord Ashton, then flipped backward. Read about my father's death 2 years ago, how he'd gambled away our security and left us dependent on my mother's distant connections. Read about the endless parade of suitors who saw me as a solution to their own problems too plain for love, too well-bred to dismiss entirely. Read about the Duke himself, the man everyone called the Ice Duke for his legendary emotional control, whose rare appearances at social functions left every unmarried woman breathless and disappointed in equal measure. He looks at people like they're equations to be solved. I'd written 3 weeks ago, as if emotion is beneath him, as if the rest of us are somehow defective for feeling things he cannot understand. I wonder if anything ever truly touches him, or if he's as cold inside as his reputation suggests. I read that entry aloud too, every bitter, honest word, and that's when he spoke from the shadows. Now, before I continue with what happened next, and trust me, what happened next changed absolutely everything. If you love stories about forbidden truths and impossible situations where one wrong word could destroy everything, then please subscribe to Velvet and Vintage Tales. Hit that bell icon because you won't want to miss what happens when a woman's most private confessions fall into the hands of the one man powerful enough to ruin her completely. Because that's exactly where I found myself. Alone in an attic with the Duke of Ravensworth. My diary still open in my shaking hands. Every secret I'd ever kept now laid bare before a man who could destroy me with a single word to the right people. The silence after he spoke stretched so long I began to wonder if I'd imagined his voice entirely. Perhaps desperation really had driven me mad. Perhaps I'd conjured him from the shadows like some dark phantom, born of my own fevered imagination. Then he moved. The moonlight caught him as he emerged from behind an old wardrobe I hadn't even noticed, and oh God, He was real. Devastatingly, terrifyingly real. The Duke of Ravensworth stood perhaps 10 feet away, dressed in evening clothes that somehow looked elegant even here, surrounded by forgotten furniture and broken dreams. His face was as I'd seen it across ballrooms, all sharp angles and aristocratic lines, the kind of face that would be handsome if it weren't so carefully controlled. But his eyes were different than I'd thought. Everyone said they were gray, cold as winter steel, but here, in this half-light, they were darker, storm dark, and fixed on me with an intensity that made breathing suddenly complicated. "Your Grace?" My voice came out strangled. The diary slipped from my fingers, hit the floor with a soft thud that sounded like thunder in the close space. I didn't realize anyone else was here. You thought you were alone," he finished, his voice carrying that same controlled precision he was famous for. He didn't move closer. Didn't need to. His presence filled the attic like smoke, inescapable. A reasonable assumption. This wing is closed during entertainments. Most people respect boundaries. The implied criticism stung. I needed air, space. I didn't mean to intrude on your privacy. My privacy? Something that might have been amusement flickered across his features. "Miss Carwell, you're standing in my attic, reading aloud intimate confessions about me and half of London's aristocracy. I'm not certain either of us has much privacy left." Heat flooded my cheeks. Of course he'd heard everything. Every spiteful observation. Every desperate confession. Every word I'd written about him specifically. The equation, comment. The coldness, God, I'd called him cold. And here he was, having heard it all. I should leave. I bent to retrieve my diary, but he was faster. He crossed the space between us in 3 long strides and picked it up before I could reach it. His fingers, long, elegant, utterly controlled, held my most private possession like it weighed nothing at all. "Please," I whispered, "please give that back." He didn't. Instead, he opened it. Right there, standing close enough that I could smell sandalwood and something darker smoke, maybe, or just the scent of power worn like cologne. His eyes scanned the page, and I watched his expression for any change, any crack in that legendary control. Nothing. He read my words, my pain, my fears, my secret, desperate longings, and his face remained as smooth as marble. "You write well," he said finally, still reading. "Your observations are sharp, occasionally cruel, but sharp." He looked up, met my gaze. "Is this truly how you see me? As some kind of emotionless calculation machine?" The question caught me off guard. I'd expected anger, perhaps amusement, maybe even threats. But this sounded almost like genuine curiosity, as if my opinion actually mattered to him. I swallowed hard. "I write what I observe, Your Grace. If my observations are incorrect, then I apologize." "You didn't answer the question." He closed the diary but didn't return it. "Do you believe I'm incapable of feeling? That I look at people as equations?" The truth sat heavy on my tongue. I could lie, should lie. But something about the way he asked, the careful precision masking what might have been actual vulnerability, made honesty feel less like suicide and more like necessity. "I believe," I said slowly, "that you've learned to hide what you feel. That somewhere, perhaps, beneath all that control, there's a man who's been hurt enough times that showing emotion feels dangerous. But I don't know you, Your Grace. I only know what I've observed from a distance." Silence. He stared at me with those storm-dark eyes, and I couldn't read his expression at all. Then, shockingly, he smiled. It was a small thing, barely a curve of lips, but it transformed his entire face. "You're perceptive," he said. "Dangerously so." He held up the diary. "And this? This is dangerous too. Do you understand what would happen if these observations, these confessions, fell into the wrong hands?" My stomach dropped. "Are you threatening me?" "I'm stating facts." He moved to a dust-covered chair, sat with perfect posture despite the circumstances. "You've written candidly about Lord Ashton's character, about your own family's financial difficulties, about my personal habits and the private behaviors of half the peerage. In the wrong hands, this diary could destroy your reputation, your mother's social standing, and any hope you have of a decent marriage. I'm already facing an indecent marriage, I shot back. Lord Ashton is a predator. The Duke's voice went flat. Yes, I'm aware of his proclivities. He's been warned repeatedly about his behavior toward women in vulnerable positions. Something in his tone made me brave. Then why is he still received everywhere? Why do mothers still push their daughters toward him? Because he has money and a title, and those things matter more than character. The Duke ran a finger along the diary's spine. But that's rather my point, Miss Carwell. You're in a vulnerable position. Your family has no money, no influence. Your only currency is your reputation. And this? He held up the diary again. This could destroy that currency in an instant. Then perhaps my reputation isn't worth protecting if it requires me to marry a man like Lord Ashton and pretend I'm grateful for the honor. The words escaped before I could stop them. Raw and bitter. The Duke's expression shifted surprise, maybe, or something deeper I couldn't name. You'd rather be ruined than married? He asked quietly. I'd rather be honest than either. I wrapped my arms around myself, suddenly cold despite the stifling attic air. I'm tired, Your Grace. Tired of smiling when I want to scream. Tired of pretending Lord Ashton's attention is flattering rather than horrifying. Tired of being treated like a problem to be solved rather than a person who might have her own thoughts and feelings about her future. He studied me for a long moment, and I couldn't shake the sensation of being truly seen for the first time in years. Not as Alina Carwell, the impoverished gentleman's daughter with acceptable looks in desperate circumstances. Just Alina, a woman with opinions and fears and enough reckless honesty to read her private thoughts aloud in an attic. What if I told you, the Duke said slowly, that there might be another option? My heart stuttered. What do you mean? I mean that I'm in possession of information that could either destroy you or protect you, depending on how it's used. He stood, still holding my diary, and I find myself faced with a choice about what to do with that information. I don't understand. He crossed to me, close enough that I had to tilt my head back to maintain eye contact. This close, I could see the faint lines around his eyes, evidence that the Ice Duke perhaps felt more than his reputation suggested. You wrote that I see people as equations, he said softly. You're not entirely wrong, but here's what you don't understand about equations, Miss Carwell. Sometimes, solving them requires changing the variables. You're not making sense. No, he held out the diary, and I reached for it automatically. But when my fingers touched the leather, he didn't let go. We stood there, both holding my secrets between us. Then let me be clear. I can't give you this diary and simply walk away. I've heard too much, know too much. Your words about Lord Ashton alone, if I remain silent about his character while knowing what you've observed, what you've clearly experienced yourself, I become complicit in whatever harm he causes next. You said he'd been warned. Warnings don't work on men like him. The Duke's voice went hard. They need to be stopped, which requires evidence, witnesses, women brave enough to speak truth rather than maintain convenient fictions. Understanding dawned, cold and heavy. You want me to testify against him, to make my observations public. I want you to be free, he corrected. Truly free, not married to a predator, not forced into poverty and desperation, not silenced by fear of social consequences. That's impossible. Women like me don't get to be free. Perhaps. His thumb brushed over my knuckles, still clutching the diary. Or perhaps the equation has been missing the right variables. Perhaps what we need is someone willing to speak honestly about what everyone already knows, but refuses to acknowledge. My breath caught. If I do this, if I speak out against Lord Ashton, I'll be ruined anyway. No one will believe me. They'll say I'm bitter, jealous, desperate. Not if you're not alone. The Duke released the diary, but his gaze held me pinned. What if there were other women? What if Lord Ashton's pattern of behavior could be documented, proven, made undeniable? What if you had protection? Social, financial, legal, to ensure speaking truth didn't leave you destroyed. Why? The question burst out. Why would you help me? What do you gain from this? For the first time since emerging from the shadows, the Duke's careful control cracked. His expression shifted into something raw, something almost painful. Because, he said quietly, 12 years ago, my sister read her diary aloud in an attic. She'd written about the man courting her, about the things he did when no one was watching, about her fear of the marriage everyone was pushing her toward, and someone overheard her, just as I overheard you. But that person didn't help. That person used her words against her, called her hysterical, ruined her reputation to silence her complaints. My chest tightened. Your Grace, I don't. She married him anyway, he continued, his voice steady but his eyes betraying everything. Because what choice did she have? A ruined woman with no money and no options. She married him, and he killed her. Not with violence, nothing so obvious. Just slowly, methodically, with cruelty and isolation, until she simply stopped. 3 years of marriage, Miss Carwell. 3 years of my sister dying by inches while everyone pretended not to notice because acknowledging the truth would have been inconvenient. The attic air felt too thick to breathe. I understood now the careful control, the emotional distance, the reputation for coldness. The Duke of Ravensworth wasn't made of ice. He was made of grief held so tightly it had frozen solid. I'm sorry, I whispered. Don't be sorry. He stepped back, and his expression smoothed back into that careful neutrality. Be brave, because I can't give you back your diary and let you walk into Lord Ashton's trap knowing what I know. But I also can't force you to speak truth if you're not willing to face the consequences. What are you asking me? I'm asking if you're willing to change the equation with me. He moved toward the attic door, then paused. Think carefully, Miss Carwell. If you say yes, everything changes. Your life, your future, your understanding of what's possible for a woman in your position. But if you say no, I'll return your diary. We'll both leave this attic, and we'll pretend this conversation never happened. And Lord Ashton will marry some other vulnerable woman, and the pattern will continue. The weight of it settled on my shoulders like a physical thing. Behind me, the attic stretched dark and full of forgotten things. Ahead, the Duke stood in the doorway, moonlight catching the edges of his perfect posture, waiting for an answer that would determine not just my future, but potentially the futures of other women I'd never meet. I thought about my diary, about all those honest words I'd written in darkness, about how reading them aloud had felt dangerous but also free finally, blessedly free. If I say yes, I heard myself ask, where do we start? The Duke's expression shifted into something I couldn't quite name. Relief, maybe. Or recognition, like he'd been waiting 12 years for someone to ask that question. We start, he said, by finding the other women who've written their truths in diaries they thought no one would read. And then we teach the world that some voices cannot be silenced, no matter how inconvenient the truth they speak. He extended his hand across the threshold, an invitation, a partnership, a promise that the equation could be solved differently than everyone assumed. I crossed the attic, dust motes swirling in my wake like tiny witnesses. My fingers closed around his, and I felt the subtle tremor in his grip, the crack in his legendary control that told me he felt this moment as deeply as I did. Then let's change the equation, I said. And in that attic, surrounded by forgotten things and impossible possibilities, the Duke of Ravensworth smiled, truly smiled, and I understood that sometimes the most dangerous truths aren't the ones we speak aloud, but the ones we're brave enough to act on. The Duke released my hand the moment we stepped out of the attic, and the loss of contact felt strangely significant, like we'd crossed some invisible threshold together and now had to pretend we hadn't. Follow me, he said, his voice returning to that careful neutrality. But stay close and stay quiet. If we're seen together in this wing, questions will be asked that neither of us can afford to answer. I nodded, clutching my diary against my chest like armor. We moved through corridors I didn't recognize, past portraits of stern-faced ancestors whose painted eyes seemed to track our progress with disapproval. The sounds of the party below drifted up through the floorboards' laughter, music, the clink of crystal glasses. A world continuing exactly as it always had, oblivious to the fact that everything had just shifted. The Duke stopped before a door at the corridor's end, produced a key from his waistcoat, and unlocked it with a soft click that sounded deafening in the silence. "My private study," he said, gesturing me inside. "No servants enter without permission. We can speak freely here." The room smelled of leather and old books, tobacco, and something faintly medicinal laudanum, perhaps, though I couldn't imagine the controlled Duke of Ravensworth needing such escapes. Floor-to-ceiling shelves lined 3 walls, packed with volumes that looked actually read rather than decorative. A massive desk dominated the space, its surface covered with neat stacks of correspondence and what appeared to be legal documents. But it was the 4th wall that made my breath catch. Papers. Dozens, no, hundreds of papers pinned to the wall in careful rows. Names written in the Duke's precise hand, connected by strings of different colors. Red, blue, black, green. A web of connections that looked like madness made methodical. "What is this?" I whispered. 12 years of investigation. He moved to the wall, traced one of the red strings with his finger. Every report, every whispered story, every woman who confided something but refused to speak publicly. "Lord Ashton is here." He pointed to a name near the center, surrounded by at least 15 red strings. "But he's not alone. There are others, men who use their position, their wealth, their social power to hurt women who have no recourse." I stepped closer, reading names I recognized. Lords, viscounts, even 2 earls. Respected men, powerful men, men my mother would have been thrilled to see courting me. "You've been documenting this for 12 years? "Since Catherine died." His voice went flat on his sister's name. "I started investigating her husband naturally. Thought if I could prove what he'd done, I could see him punished. But the more I looked, the more I found. It's not isolated incidents, Miss Carwell. It's a system, a network of men who protect each other, who silence accusations through money or threats or social pressure." "Then how do you stop a system?" My voice came out smaller than I intended. "If it's not just one man but dozens, how can speaking truth possibly make a difference?" "By finding the pattern." He pulled down a folder from his desk, opened it to reveal more documents. "Ashton has courted at least 9 women in the past 7 years. 3 married him briefly before their families paid to have the unions dissolved quietly, of course, with non-disclosure agreements. 4 others broke engagements under mysterious circumstances. 1 died in a riding accident that her family insists wasn't an accident at all. And then there's you, his current target." The clinical recitation made my stomach turn. "What happened to the woman who died?" "Miss Eleanor Pritchard. She fell from her horse during a morning ride on Ashton's estate, 3 weeks before their wedding. Her neck was broken. He met my eyes. She'd confided in her sister the night before that she wanted to call off the engagement, but was afraid of what Ashton might do if she tried. Good God." "Indeed." The Duke closed the folder. "But here's what matters. Each of these women wrote about him. Letters, diary entries, confessions to friends. Pieces of evidence that individually can be dismissed as female hysteria or sour grapes. But together they form an undeniable pattern. Then why hasn't anyone stopped him?" "Because no one wants to see the pattern." The Duke's expression hardened. "It's easier to dismiss one woman as emotional, another as vindictive, a third as simply unlucky. Acknowledging the pattern means acknowledging that the system itself is designed to protect men like Ashton, and that truth," he gestured to the wall, "terrifies people far more than any individual accusation." I studied the web of connections, the careful documentation of pain spread across 12 years. "What do you need from me?" "I need you to introduce me to the women you trust, the ones who've confided their own stories, but were too afraid to speak publicly. I need you to help me gather not just accusations, but evidence letters, witnesses, documentation that can't be dismissed or buried. And if I do this," I turned to face him fully, "what happens to me when this becomes public? Because it will become public, won't it? You can't build a case this large and keep it private." "No," he admitted. "Eventually this goes before Parliament. I'm drafting legislation protections for women who testify about abuse, legal recourse for broken marriage contracts, criminal penalties for coercion. But to pass such legislation, I need to prove why it's necessary, which means public testimony, public scandal, my name in newspapers alongside accusations that will shock society. Yes, he didn't flinch from the truth. You'll be called hysterical, vindictive, a fallen woman making desperate claims. Ashton will retaliate. He has money and connections. Other men on that wall will defend him because if he falls, they might be next. You'll lose social standing, marriage prospects, possibly any hope of a conventional future. The weight of it pressed down on me. I thought of my mother, who'd pinned all her hopes on my making an advantageous match. Of Lady Ashworth, who'd been kind enough to keep me as her companion when no one else would. Of the comfortable, safe life I could have if I just stayed quiet, married someone tolerable, and pretended I'd never read my diary aloud in an attic. But, the Duke continued softly, you'll also save lives. Women who would have married Ashton, women currently trapped by men like him, women who will face this in the future. You'll change the equation for all of them. I moved closer to the wall, reading names connected by those red strings. Sarah, Elizabeth, Margaret, Catherine, women who'd suffered in silence. Women who'd tried to speak and been silenced. Women who'd died with their truths buried. Eleanor Pritchard, I said quietly. The woman who died in the riding accident. Do you have her diary? Her sister kept it. She's been too afraid to come forward, but I'll convince her. The words came out steady, certain. And the others, the ones who broke engagements, whose marriages were dissolved quietly. I'll find them. I'll gather their stories. Miss Carwell, Alina, I met his gaze. If we're going to do this, if I'm going to risk everything, then you should call me Alina. Something flickered in his storm-dark eyes. Julian, he said after a pause. When we're alone, I'm Julian. The intimacy of first names felt dangerous. More dangerous even than the conspiracy we were building. But I nodded, accepting the shift between us. I need to know something, Julian. I forced myself to use his name to cross that final social boundary. When this becomes public, will you stand beside me? Or will you hide behind your title and let me face the consequences alone? I'll stand beside you. No hesitation, no careful political calculation. I'll testify, provide evidence, use every bit of influence I have to protect you and the other women who come forward. You have my word. The word of a duke? The word of a man whose sister died because no one stood beside her. His jaw tightened. I won't fail again. I can't. The rawness in his voice undid something in my chest. This wasn't just political maneuvering or cold calculation. This was personal, driven by grief 12 years old and still sharp enough to cut. Then we have an agreement, I said. I'll gather the evidence you need. But Julian, I hesitated, then pressed forward. You need to prepare yourself for the possibility that even with evidence, even with testimony, we might lose. The system protects itself. Powerful men have been excusing their behavior for centuries. I know. He moved to the window, stared out at the moonlit gardens below. But that's not a reason to stop trying. My sister used to say that truth has weight, that eventually it becomes too heavy to bury. She believed that if enough people spoke honestly about what they'd experienced, the world would have to listen. And then she died before the world could prove her right. Yes, his reflection in the glass looked haunted, which is why I have to prove her right now. For Catherine, for Eleanor Pritchard, for every woman whose truth was too inconvenient to acknowledge. I joined him at the window, standing close enough that our sleeves almost touched. Below, couples danced in the ballroom, visible through the tall windows, perfect, graceful, performing the elaborate social rituals that kept everyone in their proper place. I saw him tonight, I said quietly. Lord Ashton, before I ran to the attic. He cornered me near the conservatory and told me about the arrangements he planned to make after our wedding. The way he described them, my voice caught. It wasn't love or even desire. It was ownership, complete control. Julian's reflection went rigid. What exactly did he say? I told him everything. The specific threats disguised as promises, the casual cruelty wrapped in gentleman's language, the absolute certainty in Ashton's voice that I would submit because I had no other choice. Speaking it aloud made it real in a way that writing in my diary hadn't made it evidence rather than just private fear. When I finished, Julian's hands were clenched on the windowsill, knuckles white with tension. "Tomorrow," he said, voice tight with controlled fury, "I'm calling on Lord Pemberton at the Home Office. Ashton can't be arrested on your testimony alone, but Pemberton can begin a formal inquiry. And Miss Carwell, Alina, I'm assigning you protection. A footman who's actually a former Bow Street runner. He'll shadow you at all social functions. Won't that seem strange? I'll say I'm concerned about a recent series of thefts at society events. No one will question a duke protecting his guests." He turned from the window, faced me directly. "But understand this. The moment Ashton realizes we're building a case against him, he becomes dangerous. Men like him don't surrender power gracefully." "I understand. Do you?" He stepped closer, and I could see the war happening behind his careful control, fear and determination fighting for dominance. "Alina, I need you to truly understand what you're agreeing to. This won't be simple testimony and legal proceedings. Ashton will come after you. He'll hire investigators to dig up any scandal in your past, spread rumors about your character, possibly even attempt direct intimidation. And his voice roughened, I can provide protection, but I can't guarantee your safety absolutely. If anything happened to you because I asked you to do this, then it would be my choice." I interrupted, my decision to speak truth rather than stay silent. "You're not forcing me, Julian. You're giving me a chance to fight back against a system that's tried to silence women like me our entire lives." He studied my face, searching for doubt or fear. I'm sure he found both. I felt both churning in my stomach, but he also must have seen the determination, because he nodded slowly. "Then we begin tomorrow. I'll send a carriage at 2 o'clock. We'll visit Eleanor Pritchard's sister together." And then he moved to his desk, pulled out a list written in his precise hand. These women, all connected to Ashton in some way, all potentially willing to testify if they know they're not alone. I took the list, read names I half recognized from society functions and gossip. Some of these women are married now to other men, which makes them safer to approach. Their husbands' reputations protect them from direct retaliation. He paused, though it also means some won't want to risk their current security by discussing their pasts. I'll convince them. I folded the list carefully, tucked it beside my diary. Women understand the language of shared experience. They'll trust me in ways they'd never trust you, no matter how well-intentioned. I know. A wry smile ghosted across his features. "Which is why I need you. I can document evidence, build legal cases, navigate political channels, but I can't speak to women's lived experiences. I can't offer the kind of solidarity that makes someone brave enough to risk everything." We stood there in his study, surrounded by 12 years of careful documentation and impossible hopes, and I felt the full weight of what we were attempting. Not just stopping one predator, but challenging the entire structure that protected him, demanding that society acknowledge truths it had spent centuries pretending not to see. "Julian," I said quietly, "when your sister died, did you blame yourself?" His expression shuddered immediately, that careful control slamming back into place. But I'd seen the flash of pain before he could hide it, and I knew the answer. "Every day," he admitted finally. "I was supposed to protect her. I'm her older brother. I should have seen what her husband was, should have stopped the marriage, should have," he caught himself jaw tight, "should have done something other than stand by and watch it happen." "You were what, 20? 21? 22, old enough to act, old enough to be bound by the same social rules that trapped Catherine." I moved closer, daring to reach out and touch his arm, a brief contact, but enough to make him look at me. "You can't save her, Julian. She's gone. But you can honor her memory by saving the women who come after. That's what this is really about, isn't it? Not politics or justice, but grief transformed into purpose." His eyes met mine, and for a moment the Ice Duke was just a man who'd lost his sister and never forgiven himself. "Is that so wrong?" "No." My hand fell away, but I held his gaze. "It's the most human thing I've ever seen you do. The clock on his mantel chimed 11 times, pulling us back to reality. The party below would continue for hours yet, but I'd already been missing too long. My mother would be frantic, Lady Ashworth confused, Lord Ashton potentially suspicious. "You need to return," Julian said, reading my thoughts. "Take the servants' stairs at the end of this corridor. They'll bring you out near the ladies' retiring room. Fix your hair, compose yourself, and rejoin the party as if you've simply been indisposed. And you? I'll wait 15 minutes, then return separately." He moved to his desk, produced a small card embossed with his seal. "If you need to reach me urgently, send word to this address. It's a legal office I maintain for sensitive correspondence. No one monitors it except my most trusted clerk." I took the card, slipped it into my bodice alongside my diary. 2 secrets now, pressed against my heart. "Tomorrow then?" I said. 2 o'clock. Tomorrow. He walked me to the door, paused with his hand on the knob. "Alina, thank you for being brave enough to read your truth aloud, even when you thought no one was listening." "Someone was listening." I smiled slightly. Turns out that made all the difference. I left him standing in his study, surrounded by evidence of systematic cruelty and impossible dreams of justice. The corridor seemed darker than before, shadows pressing closer as I made my way to the servants' stairs. But I wasn't afraid. For the first time in my 22 years, I was walking towards something rather than running away. And that, I thought as I descended into the sounds of laughter and music, was its own kind of freedom, even if it cost me everything. The carriage arrived precisely at 2 o'clock, just as Julian had promised. I watched from Lady Ashworth's drawing room window as it pulled up unmarked, deliberately plain, the kind of vehicle that wouldn't attract notice in any London street. Smart. Everything about Julian was carefully calculated. I was learning. Even his rescues were strategic. "You're certain you must go out?" Lady Ashworth asked behind me, worry creasing her face. "You've seemed so pale since last night's entertainment. Perhaps you should rest." "I'm perfectly well," I lied, pulling on my gloves. "The Duke of Ravensworth's cousin requested my assistance reviewing some correspondence. Apparently, she's heard I have neat handwriting." The lie tasted bitter, but necessary. I couldn't tell Lady Ashworth the truth that I was about to spend the afternoon documenting evidence against one of society's most eligible bachelors. That I'd agreed to risk everything to expose a pattern of cruelty she'd probably dismiss as unfortunate misunderstandings. The Duke's cousin? Lady Ashworth's expression shifted to something between surprise and calculation. "I wasn't aware he had family visiting London." "A distant relation," I added quickly. "From the country. Quite elderly, I understand." Another lie. But Lady Ashworth nodded, apparently satisfied. "Well, don't linger too long. Lord Ashton sent a note this morning requesting permission to call at 4 o'clock. He was most insistent about speaking with you." My stomach clenched. "Did he say what about?" "He mentioned discussing future arrangements with your mother and me present." Lady Ashworth smiled encouragingly. "I believe he intends to make his intentions formal, dear. This is good news. Very good news, considering your circumstances." I forced my expression into something resembling pleased anticipation. How thoughtful of him. But inside, panic clawed at my throat. Future arrangements. The same phrase he'd used last night when cornering me by the conservatory, when describing in horrifying detail exactly what kind of wife he expected me to be. Obedient, silent, grateful for whatever scraps of dignity he allowed me to keep. The carriage couldn't arrive fast enough. Julian sat inside, dressed more casually than I'd ever seen him. A simple gray coat, no elaborate cravat, clothing that wouldn't mark him as aristocracy at a glance. He held out his hand to help me in, and I noticed he wore no rings, no watch chain, nothing that might identify his status. "You're disguised," I observed as the carriage lurched into motion. "We're visiting women who have reason to distrust powerful men," he said. "Arriving as the Duke of Ravensworth would undermine every assurance I could give about their safety." He studied my face. "You look terrified. What happened?" I told him about Lord Ashton's request to call, about the formal discussion of future arrangements. Julian's expression went dangerously still. "We need to move faster than I'd planned," he said quietly. If Ashton's pressing for an official engagement, he's confident of success, which means he's been assured by someone that my family has no other options. I clenched my hands in my lap. My mother's been negotiating with him, hasn't she? Behind my back. Most likely. Julian leaned forward, his voice gentle despite the harsh truth. Alina, if your mother accepts Ashton's proposal on your behalf this afternoon, you'll have very limited legal recourse to refuse. The law sides with families in matters of marriage contracts, especially when there are financial considerations. Financial considerations. The words tasted like poison. You mean my family's debts, the gambling losses my father left behind, the dependence on Lady Ashworth's charity that makes us desperate enough to sell me to a monster. Yes, he didn't soften it, but that's exactly why Eleanor Pritchard's sister needs to speak with you today. She has documentation letters Eleanor wrote, describing Ashton's behavior during their courtship. If we can get that evidence into the right hands before 4 o'clock, it won't matter. I cut him off. My mother won't care what letters some dead girl wrote. She'll see a wealthy lord offering security, and that's all that will matter to her. Then we make sure it matters to Lord Pemberton at the Home Office. Julian pulled a document from his coat pocket. This is a preliminary inquiry order. If Pemberton signs it based on Eleanor's letters and your testimony, Ashton becomes a person of official interest. No family would allow their daughter to marry someone under formal investigation. Hope flickered, dangerous and desperate. Will Pemberton sign it? If the evidence is compelling enough? Julian's jaw tightened. But Alina, you need to understand what you're agreeing to. Once we file this inquiry, there's no going back. Ashton will know someone's spoken against him. He'll suspect you immediately. Good. The word came out harder than I intended. Let him know I'm not afraid of him. You should be. Julian's voice went quiet. Men like Ashton are most dangerous when cornered. The protection I mentioned, the former Bow Street runner, he'll need to start immediately. Today, the carriage slowed, pulling to a stop before a modest townhouse in a respectable but unfashionable part of London. Julian glanced out the window, then back at me. Margaret Pritchard lives here with her husband and 3 children. She's been in mourning for Eleanor for 5 years. What I need you to understand is that asking her to relive her sister's death, to hand over Eleanor's private letters, to potentially testify publicly, it's cruel. Necessary, but cruel. Then why are we doing it? Because Eleanor's death wasn't an accident, and Margaret knows it. Because living with that knowledge, unable to speak it, is its own kind of torture. He reached across the carriage, caught my hand, because sometimes the only way to honor the dead is to make sure they didn't die for nothing. His hand was warm, steady, and I drew strength from the contact. Then let's make sure Eleanor's truth matters. Margaret Pritchard answered the door herself, a woman in her early 30s with Eleanor's same dark hair, but none of her sisters reported vivacity. She looked worn, grief-aged beyond her years, and when she saw Julian, her expression shuddered immediately. Mrs. Pritchard, Julian said gently, thank you for agreeing to see us. May we come in? She hesitated, eyes moving between Julian and me, clearly weighing the risk. Then she stepped back, allowing us entry into a small but neat sitting room that smelled of beeswax and faintly of lilies, funeral flowers. I realized with a pang, my husband is at his office, Margaret said, her voice carefully neutral. He doesn't know I'm meeting with you. He thinks it's better to let the past stay buried. The past isn't staying buried, Mrs. Pritchard, Julian said. It's repeating itself. Lord Ashton is currently courting Miss Carwell here, with the apparent intention of making her his wife. Margaret's gaze snapped to me, and something raw flashed in her eyes. Recognition, horror, desperate fear. No, you can't let him. You can't. Her voice broke. Please tell me your family hasn't agreed to this. Not yet. My throat felt tight, but they will, unless I can prove why they shouldn't. Margaret sank into a chair, hands trembling in her lap. Eleanor tried to prove it. She told our parents what he was doing, how he'd been during their engagement. She showed them letters where he'd made threats disguised as affection. They said she was being dramatic, that all men were demanding, that she needed to adjust her expectations. Do you still have the letters? Julian asked quietly. I have everything. Margaret looked up at him, tears tracking down her cheeks. Every letter she wrote me during the engagement, describing what he did. Every note he sent her, all those sweet words that turned threatening the moment she tried to establish any boundary. Her diary from the last month before she died. Her voice cracked completely. She knew. She wrote that she knew he was going to kill her, and no one believed her. No one. The room felt too small, the air too thick. I crossed to Margaret, knelt beside her chair, took her shaking hands in mine. "I believe you," I said. "I believe Eleanor. And I need you to know that what you're carrying, that evidence, that truth, it can save other women. It can save me." Margaret stared at me, searching my face for something. "If I give you Eleanor's letters, if I testify about what she told me, Lord Ashton will come after my family. He has money, influence, and I have 12 years of documented evidence that he's not the only predator hiding behind respectability." Julian interrupted. "Mrs. Pritchard, I'm not asking you to fight him alone. I'm asking you to be part of a pattern so undeniable that even Ashton's wealth can't erase it." "A pattern?" Margaret's voice wavered. 15 women, Julian said. "That we know of. 15 women who've experienced some version of what Eleanor described. Most are too afraid to speak. Some are dead. But if we can gather enough evidence, enough testimony, we can stop him from ever doing this again." Margaret was silent for a long moment, staring at her hands where they clutched mine. Then she stood, moved to a writing desk in the corner, and pulled out a wooden box bound with ribbon. "These are Eleanor's letters," she said, her voice steadier now. Every word she wrote about what he was doing to her, what he threatened, how she felt trapped. "And this," she withdrew a slim leather journal, "this is her diary from the last 3 months before her death." She held them out to Julian, but her eyes were on me. She was 20 years old. She loved painting and poetry. She wanted children someday, a quiet life in the country. She deserved better than dying terrified on Ashton's estate while everyone called it an unfortunate accident. "She did," I agreed softly. "And I promise you, Margaret, we're going to make sure her death meant something." Julian took the box and journal with careful reverence, as if they were sacred objects, which, in a way, they were the last testimony of a woman silenced too soon. "I'll need you to swear a formal statement," he told Margaret, "describing what Eleanor told you when she told you, any witnesses to her distress. It won't be comfortable. Nothing about this is comfortable." Margaret straightened her shoulders. "But if it stops him, if it saves even one woman from what Eleanor suffered, then I'll swear to whatever you need." We spent the next hour going through Eleanor's letters chronologically. The progression was horrifying, starting with Ashton's charming courtship, deteriorating into subtle threats and controlling behavior, culminating in Eleanor's final entries, where her handwriting grew increasingly frantic. "I think he means to kill me," she'd written a week before her death. "Not violently, nothing that would raise suspicion, but he keeps suggesting we ride in dangerous terrain, keeps insisting I take jumps I'm not comfortable with. Yesterday, he adjusted my saddle himself and waved away the groom who tried to check it. I'm afraid. I'm so terribly afraid, and there's no one I can tell who will believe me." Reading those words, knowing what came after, made me physically ill. Julian's expression remained controlled, but I saw his hands tighten on the journal until his knuckles went white. "This is enough," he said finally. "More than enough for Pemberton to open a formal inquiry." He looked at Margaret. "I'll need to take these documents, but I'll provide you with certified copies and a receipt. They'll be kept in secure storage at my solicitor's office. Keep them." Margaret's voice was hollow. "I've carried Eleanor's truth for 5 years. Let someone else carry it now. Let someone use it the way it was meant to be used to stop him." The clock on the mantel chimed 3:30. I felt the time like a physical weight. In 30 minutes, Lord Ashton would arrive at Lady Ashworth's townhouse. My mother would be there, eager and desperate, and I would be expected to smile graciously while they discussed the terms of my captivity. "We need to go," I told Julian. "Now." He saw the panic in my face and moved immediately. We said quick farewells to Margaret, promises to stay in touch, assurances of protection, gratitude that felt inadequate for the gift she'd given us. In the carriage, Julian opened Eleanor's diary again, scanning the final entries with focused intensity. "She describes his violence here," he said, pointing to a passage. "Not against her, but against a servant who displeased him. She writes about how methodically he beat the man, how controlled he remained throughout. This isn't passion or loss of temper, this is calculated cruelty. Will it be enough to stop him?" "It's enough to delay him." Julian met my eyes. "If we get to Pemberton before 4 o'clock, if he agrees to open the inquiry immediately, we can send word to Lady Ashworth's house that Ashton is under investigation. No formal engagement will proceed under those circumstances. And if we don't get there in time?" Julian's silence was answer enough. The carriage raced through London streets, and I watched the city blur past while clutching Eleanor's journal against my chest. She died trying to speak her truth. I was still alive, still able to fight. But the margin between those two outcomes suddenly felt terrifyingly narrow. "Julian," I said quietly, "if this works, if we stop Ashton and expose the pattern, what happens to me after?" He looked up from the letters, and in his storm-dark eyes I saw the weight of a question he'd clearly been avoiding. "I don't know," he admitted. "Society doesn't reward women who speak uncomfortable truths. Your reputation will be complicated at best, ruined at worst. The marriage prospects you had limited as they were will evaporate entirely. So I'll be free," I said. "Free of expectations, free of the marriage market, free of pretending to be someone I'm not. Free and alone." His voice was gentle. "Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Eleanor Pritchard, about her diary entries describing the desperate loneliness of knowing a truth no one would believe, about Margaret, carrying her sister's secrets for 5 years with no one to share the burden, about all the women on Julian's wall, their red strings connecting suffering that society insisted on seeing as isolated incidents. "I'd rather be alone with my truth," I said, "than married to a man who demands I bury it." Julian's expression shifted into something I couldn't quite name: admiration, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred spirit. "Then let's make sure you survive long enough to enjoy that freedom," he said. The carriage turned onto Whitehall, and I saw the Home Office building ahead. Nearly 4 o'clock, nearly too late, but not quite. We burst through Lord Pemberton's office door at 7 minutes to 4, Eleanor's evidence clutched in Julian's hands, both of us breathless and desperate. And as Pemberton looked up from his desk, surprise and then dawning understanding crossing his features, I felt the equation shift. Not solved yet, but changing. Finally, impossibly, changing. Lord Pemberton was a large man with kind eyes and the careful demeanor of someone who'd spent decades navigating political minefields. He listened without interruption as Julian laid out the evidence. Eleanor's letters spread across his desk like accusations, her diary open to that final devastating entry about fear and adjusted saddles and the certainty of approaching death. "This is substantial," Pemberton said finally, his voice grave. "More than substantial, if even half of what Miss Pritchard documented is accurate." "It's all accurate," I interrupted. "I've experienced a version of it myself. Lord Ashton's courtship follows a pattern. Charm that slowly transforms into control. Affection that reveals itself as ownership. He's doing to me exactly what he did to Eleanor, and if my family accepts his proposal today," my voice caught, "I'll end up exactly like her." Pemberton's gaze shifted to me, assessing. "Miss Carwell, you understand that opening a formal inquiry will make you a target? Lord Ashton has considerable resources. He'll claim you're a spurned woman, that you fabricated these accusations out of jealousy or spite. Let him claim whatever he likes." I leaned forward, hands pressed flat on Pemberton's desk. "Eleanor Pritchard is dead. 9 other women have suffered marriages so horrific, their families paid fortunes to dissolve them. 4 more broke engagements under circumstances they've never publicly explained. How many more women need to be hurt before someone with actual power decides the pattern matters more than one man's reputation?" Silence. Pemberton studied me with those careful eyes, and I forced myself not to look away, not to soften my words with apology or feminine deference. Eleanor hadn't been believed because she'd been too polite, too willing to couch her truth in language that wouldn't offend. I wouldn't make the same mistake. "The Duke speaks highly of your courage," Pemberton said finally. "The Duke," Julian interjected quietly, "has spent 12 years documenting systematic abuse that everyone pretends not to see. Miss Carwell is simply the first woman brave enough to let her voice be added to that documentation while she's still alive to defend it." The words hung heavy in the office. Pemberton glanced at the clock 3 minutes to 4, then back at the evidence covering his desk. "If I open this inquiry immediately," he said slowly, "I'll need to send notification to Lord Ashton's residence before any engagement can be formalized. The investigation will become public knowledge within hours. There will be scandal, Miss Carwell. Enormous scandal." "Good," I said. "Let there be scandal. Let society finally acknowledge what it's been ignoring." Pemberton picked up Eleanor's diary, read that final entry again. His expression hardened. "Very well. I'll draft the preliminary inquiry order now. But Miss Carwell, you'll need protection the moment Ashton receives notification." "Already arranged," Julian cut in. "Thomas Crawford, formerly of Bow Street. He's waiting outside." "Crawford?" Pemberton's eyebrows rose. "You hired Crawford? He's the best investigator in London." "Which is precisely why Miss Carwell needs him." Julian's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "Ashton won't be able to get near her without Crawford knowing about it first." As if summoned, there was a knock at the door. A man entered, tall, broad-shouldered, with the alert eyes of someone trained to spot danger before it struck. Thomas Crawford, I assumed. He nodded respectfully to Pemberton, then turned to me. "Miss Carwell," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle for such an imposing figure. His Grace explained the situation. "I'll be accompanying you everywhere from this moment forward. No one gets close without my approval." The reality of it settled over me like a cloak, heavy, protective, but also undeniably confining. This was my life now, watched, guarded, marked as someone who needed protection from a man society considered respectable. Pemberton worked quickly, his pen scratching across official documents with practiced efficiency. Within 10 minutes, he'd drafted the inquiry order, sealed it, and summoned a clerk to deliver it immediately to Lord Ashton's residence. "This will reach him within the half hour," Pemberton said. "I'm also sending word to Lady Ashworth's townhouse that any discussion of marriage contracts should be postponed pending the outcome of an official Home Office inquiry. That should prevent your family from finalizing anything in your absence." Relief flooded through me so intensely I felt dizzy. "Thank you, thank you." "Don't thank me yet." Pemberton's expression was serious. "This is only the beginning. The inquiry will require formal testimony from you, from Margaret Pritchard, from any other women willing to come forward. It will be invasive, uncomfortable, and very public. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about Eleanor, about her frantic handwriting in those final diary entries, about the isolation of carrying truth no one wanted to hear, about the choice between comfortable silence and dangerous honesty. "I'm prepared," I said. The carriage ride back to Lady Ashworth's townhouse felt surreal. Crawford sat beside the driver, alert and watchful. Inside, Julian and I were silent, the weight of what we'd just set in motion pressing down on both of us. "You were magnificent," Julian said finally. "The way you spoke to Pemberton, no apology, no feminine softening, just truth delivered like a weapon." "It is a weapon." I stared out the window at London, passing by all those elegant facades hiding so much suffering. Eleanor tried to be polite about her truth, and it killed her. I won't make that mistake. "No," Julian agreed quietly. "You won't." The carriage stopped outside Lady Ashworth's townhouse. I could see figures moving behind the drawing room curtains. My mother, Lady Ashworth, someone else I didn't recognize. The meeting was already underway. "Crawford will accompany you inside," Julian said. "I'll wait here until we're certain the notification has been received." I nodded, then hesitated. "Julian, what happens after? After the inquiry? After Ashton is—" I couldn't finish the sentence. Stopped? Punished? Imprisoned? None of those outcomes seemed certain enough to name aloud. "After," Julian said, "you rebuild your life on your own terms, and you won't do it alone. The women who come forward, Margaret Pritchard, others like her, you'll have allies. A community of people who understand the cost of speaking truth. And you? The question escaped before I could stop it. Where will you be in this rebuilt life? His expression shifted, that careful control cracking just enough to show something vulnerable beneath. Wherever you need me to be, Alina. I didn't spend 12 years documenting this pattern just to abandon the woman brave enough to help me expose it. The words felt like a promise, though I wasn't certain what kind. Partnership? Friendship? Something more complicated than either? But there was no time to examine it. Crawford opened the carriage door, offered his hand, and reality demanded my attention. Inside the townhouse, I found precisely the scene I'd feared. My mother sat on the settee, her face alight with desperate hope. Lady Ashworth looked worried but resigned, and standing by the fireplace, drink in hand, was Lord Ashton himself. Miss Carwell, his voice was smooth as silk, but his eyes held something hard. How fortuitous. We were just discussing your future. Were you? I kept my voice level, aware of Crawford's presence just behind me. How presumptuous, considering you haven't asked me about my thoughts on that future. My mother gasped. Alina, Lord Ashton was kind enough to come here personally to what? I turned to face her fully. To negotiate my sale? To discuss terms of ownership? To assure you all that he'll take good care of his new possession? Alina, my mother's face went white. You will apologize this instant. Lord Ashton is a gentleman, and we are fortunate. Lord Ashton, I said clearly, is currently under investigation by the Home Office for a pattern of abusive behavior toward women spanning at least a decade. I believe you'll be receiving official notification of that inquiry shortly. The room went utterly silent. Ashton's expression shifted from smooth confidence to something dangerous. You've been speaking to the Duke of Ravensworth, he said, his voice low and cold. Spreading vicious lies because you're angry I chose to pursue you despite your family's disgraceful circumstances. I've been speaking with Margaret Pritchard, I corrected. Eleanor Pritchard's sister. You remember Eleanor, don't you? The woman whose neck broke so conveniently during a riding accident 3 weeks before your wedding? Ashton's face went pale, then flushed with rage. He took a step toward me, and Crawford immediately moved between us, a wall of protective muscle. I think you should leave, my lord, Crawford said quietly, before you do something that confirms every accusation Miss Carwell just made. This is outrageous. Ashton's voice shook with barely controlled fury. I will not be threatened in. A knock at the door interrupted him. The butler entered, carrying a sealed document on a silver tray. A message from the Home Office, my lord. The messenger said it required your immediate attention. Ashton snatched the document, broke the seal, read. I watched the color drain from his face as he processed Pemberton's notification. When he looked up, his eyes were full of pure hatred. You'll regret this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Both of you. The Duke and his little crusade, you and your delusions of importance. I have resources, connections, influence you can't begin to comprehend. By the time I'm finished, by the time you're finished, Julian's voice came from the doorway. You'll be facing criminal charges for coercion, assault, and potentially murder. I'd suggest you retain excellent legal counsel, Ashton. You're going to need it. Ashton spun to face Julian, and the rage in his expression would have been terrifying if Crawford weren't standing between us. You self-righteous bastard. You think your title protects you? I think, Julian interrupted calmly, that 15 women's testimony will be rather difficult to dismiss as jealous fabrication. I think Eleanor Pritchard's diary entries describing your violence are fairly damning. And I think that threatening Miss Carwell in front of witnesses while under active investigation demonstrates remarkably poor judgment. He smiled, cold and precise. But please, do continue. I'm certain Lord Pemberton would love to add witness intimidation to the list of charges. Ashton stared at Julian, at me, at Crawford standing immovable between us. Then, with a sound of pure frustration, he threw the official notification on the floor and stormed from the townhouse. The silence after he left was deafening. Alina, my mother said finally, her voice shaking, what have you done? He was our only option. Without his offer, we have nothing. We are nothing. We're alive, Mother. I turned to face her. We're poor, yes, dependent on charity, absolutely, but we're alive and free, which is more than Eleanor Pritchard can say, more than 9 other women who married him can say about the years they lost to his cruelty. But your reputation is mine to risk. I crossed to her, took her trembling hands. Mother, I know you're afraid. I know Father's debts left us vulnerable, but selling me to a monster isn't the answer. There are other ways to survive. What other ways? She looked at me with desperate, frightened eyes. Who will have you now? Who will want a woman who's publicly accused a lord of... I will. Julian spoke from the doorway, and every head in the room turned to stare at him. That is, if Miss Carwell would consider an alternative arrangement. My heart stopped. What? He crossed the room, and there was something different in his bearing, less calculated, more raw. I need someone to help coordinate testimony for the inquiry. Someone who understands women's experiences, who can speak to witnesses with empathy and authority. Someone who's proven herself brave enough to face consequences most people spend their lives avoiding. He met my eyes. I'm offering you employment, Alina, as my official assistant in this investigation. It comes with lodging in the Ravensworth townhouse's East Wing, a proper salary, and absolute protection from anyone who might wish you harm. Employment? My mother looked scandalized. My daughter working? Like an independent woman with valuable skills, Julian corrected gently. Lady Carwell, I understand this isn't the future you imagined for your daughter, but I can assure you, she'll be far safer and more respected in my employ than she ever would have been as Lord Ashton's wife. I stared at Julian, trying to read the meaning behind his careful words. Employment, protection, an alternative to both marriage and ruin. It was more than I dared hope for when I'd read my diary aloud in that attic. Yes, I said, I accept. Julian's expression softened into something that might have been relief. Then it's settled. I'll have the contracts drawn up tomorrow. In the meantime, Crawford will remain here to ensure your safety. This is highly irregular, Lady Ashworth said, though she sounded more intrigued than disapproving. A young unmarried woman working for a bachelor duke? Then we'll ensure propriety, Julian replied smoothly. Mrs. Peterson, my housekeeper, will serve as chaperone. All work will be conducted in public spaces or with witnesses present. Miss Carwell's reputation will be protected as carefully as her physical safety. He made it sound simple, reasonable, entirely proper. But I saw the truth in his storm-dark eyes. This wasn't just employment. This was partnership, alliance. 2 people who'd found each other in an attic and decided to change the equation together. Consequences be damned. The next weeks passed in a blur of testimony and documentation. Margaret Pritchard came forward officially, her statement devastating in its detailed horror. 3 more women who'd broken engagements with Ashton found the courage to speak. 2 whose marriages had been quietly dissolved added their voices to the growing chorus. The scandal was exactly as enormous as Pemberton had predicted. Society split between those who believed us and those who insisted we were hysterical women destroying a good man's reputation. The newspapers ran daily updates, some sympathetic, most viciously critical. But the pattern was undeniable. 15 women, their stories all matching too precisely to be fabrication. The Home Office inquiry expanded into a full criminal investigation, and slowly, painfully, other men on Julian's wall began to face consequences too. It wasn't revolution, it was evolution, just as Julian had said in his study that first night. Systems changing because the truth became too heavy to bury. I moved into Ravensworth House's East Wing, and every morning I woke to the work of coordinating testimony, supporting witnesses, and helping Julian build the case that would finally stop Ashton and men like him. It was exhausting, emotionally devastating work. It was also the most purposeful I'd ever felt in my life. 6 months after that night in the attic, Lord Ashton was formally charged with coercion, assault, and based on new evidence about Eleanor's death manslaughter. The trial would take months more, the outcome uncertain, but we'd done it. We'd spoken truth loudly enough that the world had no choice but to listen. I stood in Julian's study, looking at the wall that had haunted him for 12 years. Most of the red strings had been removed now, replaced with green ones marking women who'd come forward, who'd testified, who'd survived. "You did it," I said quietly. "You honored Catherine's memory." "We did it," Julian corrected, moving to stand beside me. "You and Margaret, and all the women brave enough to speak. I just provided the framework, and the protection, and the resources, and the 12 years of careful documentation." I turned to face him. "Don't diminish what you've accomplished, Julian." He smiled, that rare, genuine expression that transformed his careful features. "Then I'll accept the gratitude if you accept that you changed everything, Alina. You read your truth aloud when you thought no one was listening, and that single act of brave honesty started all of this." We stood there in the study, surrounded by evidence of systematic change, and I thought about that night 6 months ago, how terrified I'd been, how certain that speaking truth would destroy me. I wasn't destroyed. I was free, truly, impossibly free in ways I'd never imagined possible. "Thank you," I said softly, "for listening when I thought no one could hear me." "Thank you," Julian replied, "for being brave enough to speak." And in that moment, standing in the Duke of Ravensworth's study with evidence of revolution disguised as evolution covering the walls, I understood that sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is simply tell the truth. Sometimes that's also the most powerful. If this story of courage, truth, and the power of refusing to stay silent touched your heart, please like this video and subscribe to Velvet and Vintage Tales. Turn on that notification bell so you never miss another story about love, sacrifice, and the brave souls who dared to change their world. Your support helps us continue bringing these timeless tales of romance and resilience to life. Thank you for being part of our community,